2, 1.
7 things you don't really need to know, but probably should. I'm Jamie East, and this is the Sunday Set. In today's episode, something strange is happening at the centre of the Earth. Scientists discover we share a common language with great apes, and there's finally some good news for the bees. But first, it was on this day in 1886 that Carl Benz patented the world's first automobile with a burning motor. According to the NHS, in the last year, more than 8.3 million patients in England were prescribed antidepressants. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, also known as SSRIs, are among the most widely used antidepressants. However, they come with a common side effect: emotional blunting. Whilst they dull emotional pain, people on SSRIs also report they no longer find things as pleasurable. One study suggests this could be the case for up to 60% of people taking the drug. And now a study from the University of Cambridge offers new insights.
I'm Dr. Christelle Langley, and I'm a research associate in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Cambridge.
Hi, Dr. Langley. Thanks ever so much for joining us. So we're talking about your latest study on antidepressants and emotional blunting. First of all, could you just walk us through that study and how it was carried out?
As we know, patients with neuropsychiatric disorders take these drugs for months or often even years. So because of that, understanding the longer-term effects is extremely necessary. So to do this, we recruited healthy volunteers who were either given placebo or the SSRI escitalopram for at least 21 days. So we used a number of different tests assessing what we call cold and hot cognition. So cold cognition is rational, non-emotional cognition, and it's things that we use in everyday life, such as attention and memory, whereas hot cognition is a more social and emotional cognition that we use when interacting with others, for example. So we specifically tested reinforcement learning, which is an important behavioral process that allows us to learn from our environment through either positive and rewarding or even negative feedback. So importantly, these tasks can contain a certain amount of uncertainty. So for example, in the tasks we used, you're asked to choose between a stimulus A and B. If you chose the correct stimulus, you are rewarded with positive feedback saying that you were correct 4 out of 5 times, but 1 out of 5 times you're misleadingly told that you're incorrect. And previous studies have shown that patients with depression are overly sensitive to this negative feedback, and they then respond incorrectly to the task.
Okay, this kind of emotional blunting is a pretty common side effect for people who use the drugs, although it's been unclear whether it's a symptom of the depression or the medication. What did your study reveal about that?
So our key and novel finding was that escitalopram had specific effects on reinforcement sensitivity on 2 different tests of reinforcement learning. So they had lower reinforcement sensitivity in the escitalopram group, and this may be similar to the blunting effect reported by patients during SSRI treatments. So the reason we say this is a specific effect as well is that there were no differences on between the 2 groups on other tests of hot or cold cognition. And this does suggest that escitalopram may be involved in the blunting that is experienced by patients, but it's still important to understand that this is also a symptom of depression, and this actually does make it really difficult to fully comprehend how this is happening. Dampening down of the negative emotions and the distress felt by depressed patients may actually be part of the therapeutic process for these drugs. However, as they can't selectively target negative emotions, it seems that unfortunately they may also be taking away some of the enjoyment. This doesn't mean that they're not effective, and of course not everyone who takes SSRIs experience this blunting, but it does provide a little more understanding as to how these drugs may work and helps us to provide better treatment options.
So what do those results mean for the drug? Are they still beneficial, or should they be approached with caution?
So for many people suffering from depression, SSRIs improve their condition significantly. It gives them a better quality of life and improves their ability to function in everyday life. So they're certainly still beneficial for many people. In fact, actually, a recent large study examined 21 different antidepressants and showed that they were all more effective than placebo. So the findings from our study show that more work is required to fully understand the way in which these drugs work, but it doesn't suggest that they're not still useful or necessary for many people. So interestingly, if we're able to detect depression early, we might be able to treat it effectively with psychological treatments only. And also importantly, there are several evidence-based ways to improve cognition and well-being and mental health that include things like exercise, lifelong learning, and social interaction. So using these types of techniques may actually be really helpful to promote a better well-being in everyone and not just people that experience depression.
Beneath the crust, below the mantle, and underneath the molten core is a solid spinning inner core of our planet. The core spin's been the subject of books, comics, and even Hollywood films.
The core of the Earth has stopped spinning. The spinning
But this
core
time around,
protects us
it
from
appears life is imitating art. A new study analysing seismic wave data has concluded that the core's rotation stopped around the year 2009 and then restarted in the opposite direction. This is John Vidale, a seismologist from the University of South California.
There's a very strong magnetic field down there. It's pressure and gravity and the magnetic field that all have to balance.
According to researchers, the core's changing directions in a pattern. It's rotating in one direction and then the other like a swing every few decades. A complete cycle of this swing takes about 70 years. The last rotation change before 2009 would have occurred in the early 1970s, and the next one will take place in the mid-2040s. Due to its accessibility, there's still much debate about the nature of the Earth's core.
These mineral physics people need to explore what happens at a boundary between liquid iron and solid iron. So a whole range of possibilities of things that might be happening.
It's going to take time and new modelling to better understand what's happening. Without its internal convection, Mars lost its magnetic field, its heat, and then went cold. That's not happening here, but if we can predict the subtle shifts below, we could ultimately prepare for the effects up above. Still to come on the Sunday 7, our common language with great apes, and something big is happening in Antarctica. The chimpanzee and bonobo are humans' closest living relatives. They share about 99% of our DNA, and now new research has revealed we may even share a common language. That's the conclusion of a video-based study in which volunteers translated ape gestures. It was carried out by researchers at St Andrews University and suggests the last common ancestor we shared with chimps used similar gestures, and that these may have been a starting point for our language. There are now dozens of known gestures in the Great Ape lexicon, each with a particular meaning. By showing videos of these gestures to volunteers, scientists discovered that more than half the time, humans are able to understand them. This is Kirsty Graham, the lead researcher of the study, speaking with the BBC.
We can be fairly confident that this would have been this is a communication system shared by all great ape species, including humans, and that our last common ancestors with bonobos and chimpanzees probably used quite similar gestures, and that these gestures may have then gone on to scaffold the evolution of human gesture and human language as we know it now.
Whilst the research tells us a little something about the origins of human gestures, it's important to note that only about 50% of the volunteers correctly guessed the ape gestures, which also means that around half didn't.
And I think what's important here is that we know that context is really important for our own communication. It's also really important for other great apes. So bonobos, some of their gestures have multiple meanings. So an arm raised gesture might mean climb on my back, it might mean groom me, it might mean move closer. So there's gestures that have many meanings, but they mean specific things in specific contexts. So one of our follow-up questions is whether, given more context, knowing what happens before, if people become better at interpreting these gestures.
And it's not just great apes. Other animals also make use of gestures to communicate with one another.
There's more and more evidence that it's common across other primates. So there's some nice research on baboons and on bonnet macaques and other macaque species, showing sets of around 30 to 40 gestures, about half of what we found in great apes, but maybe they'll find more. There's also some evidence of gesture in birds, so in corvids and in babblers, that they do some displays and some gestures actually with their wings and beaks. So I think it might be quite widespread that across the animal kingdom, there is some ability to use these body actions as ways of communicating, but nothing quite as rich as what we see in other great apes so far.
You might be sitting listening to this thinking, yeah, sure, my dog gestures to me. You know what? you wouldn't be wrong.
It does tell us something probably about how dogs and cats were domesticated, because they've gone through a selection process where we've chosen traits. We've chosen to continue breeding dogs that are attentive to our commands, to our gestures. So dogs, for instance, quite good at following pointing and understanding pointing and using some pointing themselves, where that's really uncommon across other species. So studying dogs and maybe other domesticated species can also inform us on human gesture.
And the study isn't only for the benefit of understanding how our communication develops. Dr. Graham says it can inform animal welfare too.
All great ape species are endangered. There's a lot of them in captivity, and captive breeding programs can be really important conservation tools, but equipping people with more knowledge about recognizing what the chimps and other great apes are communicating about could have important welfare implications for the apes as well.
An iceberg the size of Greater London has broken off Antarctica. The vast block of ice measures an enormous 1,150 square kilometres and broke away from the 150-metre thick Brunt ice shelf. As terrifying as this sounds, scientists were expecting it. Dominic Hodgson is a glaciologist with the British Antarctic Survey and described what happened to Euronews.
So overnight development of large cracks across the ice shelf, which made us aware that it was vulnerable to a collapse event and a calving event. And so we increased the intensity of our monitoring of that ice shelf. It's now one of the most intensely monitored ice shelves in Antarctica.
Antarctica is threatened by global warming, but glaciologists say that this phenomenon is a natural event that they were ready for. The
reason it's important, it's a very large calving event for Antarctica. We do see these sort of calving events periodically. And also the ice shelf, our station was situated on the piece of ice shelf that has broken away. So had we not moved it several years ago, we would have been in a situation now where we have a station floating off.
Still to come on the Sunday 7, a new study on altruism in kids, and we hear from the man who first discovered microplastics, right after this.
You're listening to the Sunday 7. Follow us for your weekday news espresso, or even try our Island edition. It's in all the usual places. The human urge to lend a hand extends to animals from the earliest years of life. This is according to researchers who observed toddlers interacting with friendly dogs. Children as young as 2 years old went out of their way to help dogs get toys and tasty treats that were placed beyond their reach, despite never having met the animals before. The US studies found that altruism towards other species may have helped humans thrive, and they've now observed this in children. To find out more, we sat down with one of the paper's researchers.
I'm Margaret Echelbarger. I'm an assistant professor of marketing at Stony Brook University in New York. I primarily study child consumer behavior, especially as it relates to financial decision-making and prosociality.
Hey, Margaret, thanks for coming on the Sunday 7. So today we're talking about altruism towards animals and how this has helped us thrive as humans. You and your colleague devised a study to test this. What did it look like?
To carry out the study, we recruited children 2 to 3 years of age and 3 pet dogs, my own included. And then in this quasi-naturalistic study, we assessed whether children would spontaneously help our pet dogs acquire out-of-reach toys and treats. And each child worked with only one dog. So our pet dogs were behind this porous enclosure, which allowed children to interact with the dogs on their own terms. And to test whether children would spontaneously help dogs as they do other humans, an experimenter would, for example, surreptitiously drop a treat from her pocket while leaving the room. The dog would then beg or not for the treat by pawing at the enclosure or whimpering. Children would then help the dog by picking up, again or not, the treat or toy and dropping it in the enclosure so the dog could consume it or play with it. And we coded whether dogs indicated wanting the out-of-reach object and whether children help dogs acquire those out-of-reach objects.
So what were your key findings? How did the results differ with kids who had pets at home?
So overall, children were more likely to help the dogs acquire out-of-reach objects when the dogs showed interest in them. So more specifically, children helped our dogs acquire out-of-reach objects 50% of the time when the dogs showed interest in them, but only about 25% of the time when our dogs showed no interest in them. And it was also the case that children who had pet dogs at home were even more likely to attend to dogs' desires to obtain these out-of-reach objects, both when the dogs indicated interest and not. However, critically, both children with and without pet dogs at home gave discriminately, meaning they were more likely to help the dogs acquire these out-of-reach objects when the dogs expressed interest in them.
So what do these results tell us about ourselves as humans?
So animal domestication has been advantageous to human survival, and indeed, dogs are our earliest known domesticates. Now, why we came to domesticate animals is a mystery. However, our finding that children are spontaneously prosocial toward unfamiliar pet dogs they'll never see again, provides one piece of evidence that might help us understand this mystery. And more generally, prosociality is key for many reasons, from forging social connections to maintaining a good reputation within a group. So being prosocial, being altruistic, is important for our survival.
Every year, about 10 million tonnes of plastic gets into our oceans. The plastic problem's well known now, but it wasn't always that way. In 1971, marine biologist Edward Carpenter made a shocking discovery. Edward was studying algae when he found small bits of plastic floating thousands of miles off the east coast of America in the Atlantic Ocean. Here he is speaking about the experience with the BBC.
Every time I towed my net on the surface of the ocean, I got plastic. So this really surprised me because we were so far from land. And I began to catalog the weight of the plastic and the number of particles. And at that time, it was about 3,500 particles of plastic per square kilometer. There were different types of plastic, little jagged pieces, maybe 5-6 millimeters in diameter. And there were other round plastic particles that are called by the plastics industry nurdles. And these are the raw plastic material that is sold by a plastic manufacturer to a fabricator to make into a toy or some other plastic particle.
Edward was shocked to see plastic so far out at sea and knew it needed to be documented. But the scientific community didn't welcome his discovery. Edward's boss even asked him to stop measuring plastic pollution, but Edward was determined, so he continued his research in secret.
When I put that paper together and sent it off to the journal Science, the senior scientists there at the Oceanographic did not like that paper. They said that I should really stick to biology. Within a few months of that paper being published, I then ran into plastics again. I saw what I thought was a little fish egg under the microscope, so I squeezed it with some forceps and it just popped right out. And I said, well, that's not a fish egg, that's a little sphere of plastic.
It took years, but finally the scientific community began to take note.
At the Ocean Sciences meeting in 2010 in Portland, Oregon, when they had the session on plastics and they highlighted the first two papers that I wrote in 1972, I said, finally, yes, people are beginning to take this seriously. And there has been, again, about an exponential increase in the number of papers on plastic pollution. And today we see plastic particles in the Arctic sea ice, at the top of Mount Everest, in the Alps. Everywhere that a scientist looks, there is plastic.
Our pollinators are in peril. Currently, 1 in 10 bee and butterfly species and 1 in 3 hoverfly species are threatened with extinction, and the EU wants to change that. They want to reverse the decline of insects vital for crop production using buzz lines, a blueprint for a network of ecological corridors for pollinators where they could move across Europe and find food and shelter. The plans were laid out this week by Virginia Sikevicius, the EU's Environment Commissioner.
Pollinators need stronger protection. The extinction of pollinators would cause ecosystems to fall apart. It would quite literally be the stuff of nightmares. And we have to avoid that scenario, and the New Deal for pollinators adopted today aims at reversing their decline by the year 2030.
The 7-year plan will also increase monitoring of the insects across the 27 member states, aiming to halt population decline in pollinators that are crucial to the majority of crops and wildflowers.
The first action area is better conservation of species and habitats. We will do that specifically with conservation plans for species under threat. We identify pollinators that are typical of habitats protected under the Habitats Directive and actions to step up that protection.
This has been the Sunday 7. Wherever you're listening, do us a favour and hit the follow button. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 a.m. with the regular Smart 7. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Written, produced and published by Daft Doris.